Peter B. Collins is a Bay Area Radio Hall of Famer. It's great to see you, sir. I looked for your email. Usually you send me what you want to talk about. I'm going to assume we're going to talk
Oh,
about
you know what?
Ukraine.
I responded on my phone, and it may have just gone to Hannah.
Oh,
But I did say that I would offer my recalibrated views on Ukraine because reality has overcome the speculation that we were engaged in just a week ago. And I
right.
want to acknowledge, because so many
What,
corporate
what do you
media
say?
outlets never do, that
Right.
the situation on the ground has changed. Putin's motives are now much more clear. And I was wrong about some of the things that I offered in forms of speculation. And it was driven by the skepticism that I have for the US foreign policy machine, our intelligence community, and the false flags that we have employed in the past. And so, with that, I'd just like to make a couple of comments. It does appear that the intelligence that the Biden administration was relying on and carefully leaking to its allies in the corporate media has been more or less accurate. And that perhaps they have a mole in the Kremlin, perhaps not. But in this case, unlike many of the really troubling incidents in the last 20, 22 years of American history, uh, the intelligence community appeared to understand the growing deployment of Russian forces on three sides of Ukraine. And it appears that they fed Biden information that led him to conclude, although he was off by a week, that Russia would, in fact, not just make a minor incursion into the Donbass, but would move to the capital and seek to decapitate the current government in Kiev. And I simply want to acknowledge that, because we see so often in corporate media where the pundits, the paid anchors, never address the errors that they make, or even things where the events changed after they had made statements. And I believe that if I'm to have any credibility with your viewers and listeners, David, that we have to operate in an honest manner and say, yeah, uh, I am willing to concede that things have proven that some of my concerns and speculation were off base. That
Well,
said, I have other comments to make, but you go first.
is your microphone scraping against your shirt?
Yeah, I should stop wearing shirts with a collar. Here, I'll put it up over my ear. That should do it.
That should, okay. What did you get wrong? Because this is what I believed. I, uh, I didn't think he would go in. I thought nobody, an ex KGB agent, is too smart to get himself stuck in a quagmire. You can't uh, either you're going into the next Afghanistan. It's or you're going to level the place like Syria and become a pariah on the world stage. I just didn't think he would go in. Uh, what else did what? And I was completely wrong. Um, is that what you got wrong? Is that what you?
Yes, I too believe that the costs are too great for Putin to attempt this full-scale invasion. And of course, we're all sitting here now wondering what are his long-term plans. And at the moment, I'm cheering on the Ukrainians. I certainly support their effort to resist this invasion. It doesn't mean that my commentary about the Azov battalion and their neo-Nazi inclinations was wrong. It doesn't mean that I was wrong about my critical views of the coverage by American media outlets. But uh, when events change, I think we have to speak up and acknowledge that.
Yeah, we
Uh,
talked about the Azov Battalion. Two things can be true. Three things can be true. Ukraine could have absorbed a neo-Nazi militia into its army that terrorizes women and the LGBT community. That could be true, but they also it could also be true that they're not running the military, that the Ukrainian military has made an unholy alliance with them temporarily. Ukraine is a big country with a lot of good people and bad people, but that still doesn't mean they want Russia to invade or deserve to be invaded by Russia, right?
yes, and we cannot allow the fog of war to cover the issues that have created this conflict. And I have for a long time been a critic of Thomas Friedman, op-ed writer at the New York Times and an author of books about Israel and Palestine in particular. We used to call him Tom 6 More Months Friedman when he would write these happy talk columns about the quagmire that we got bogged down in the occupation of Iraq. But last week, to his credit, one of the rare voices in the corporate media, he shared with his readers the history going back to the breakup of the Soviet Union, the promises that were made by the US when Ukraine denuclearized. It's not nuclear, it's nuclear, please. And that the history of the creep, the mission creep and the expansion of NATO to include the countries that have made Putin so uncomfortable. Now, you just said that more than one thing can be true. Putin used the pretext of NATO expansion as the basis to invade Ukraine, just like the US used the pretext of Saddam and weapons of mass destruction to invade and occupy Iraq. And I'm not as comfortable with the references to World War I and World War II, because I think the world has just changed too much. But, when you look at the moves that the United States made, where we ignored world opinion, we just bulldozed right over the UN, even after the lies that Colin Powell told about Iraqi WMD, and the Security Council and the general body of the UN, they opposed our rush to war in Iraq. And so Putin is, I think, using an American playbook. We don't hear that on CNN. And
Right.
that he feels license to take Ukraine, which is not his, because we took Iraq and then we covertly participated in Syria, and things didn't change until Russia entered that conflict. That we to this day continue to support the bloody war in Yemen. And finally, that we used NATO as a front to take down Gaddafi in Libya. And so the misadventures of the United States.
And Afghanistan, as you said, at NATO and Afghanistan.
Yes, yes. There it was simply to create the false illusion of a coalition. And
Right.
we squeezed our European partners into creating that front. And of course, you'll notice that with some exceptions, most of the NATO forces didn't leave their bases and didn't do any heavy lifting in Afghanistan. But we still had the beard of an international coalition.
Kind of like
So-
Pete Buttigieg in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
He never left the green zone.
Well, and his whole the military part of his CV was created by friendly allies in Washington who were grooming him for his presidential run.
Right.
So I think it's really important that, as I acknowledge that a week ago I had a misperception of what was likely to occur, that I'm unapologetic for criticizing the US government and the American corporate media for its faults in the origins and the run up to this conflict. And let me
Right.
turn now to the media. You go ahead.
You put up, I don't want you to forget what you were going to say. You were going to turn to the media. Can
Yeah,
I ask you?
you
Let me
go
ask
ahead.
you.
I won't forget.
We cannot help but interpret through our own biases and wishful thinking. Uh, I'm trying to figure out what my bias is when it comes to my wishful thinking. Last week was Build Back Better. We could focus on uh, our own problems and not those in Ukraine. What do you recognize your biases when you read uh, about the build up to the invasion? Is your bias mine, where you think, well, America loves war and they have to scare us and make Putin scarier than he really is, so we don't have to provide a social safety net for our people? That seems to be my bias. That it's they always somehow find a reason not to provide for Americans, and now we have Ukraine. That seems
Mine is similar, but not identical, David. And that is that I felt that once Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema blocked Build Back Better and voting rights reform, that
right.
Biden was left with, as the Godfather said, his dick in his hand. And he did pivot to this, I think, eagerly to provide a distraction. And also because his bias is that he believes that he's brilliant about foreign and military policy. And part of my skepticism is that I don't agree with his perception of himself. And that I felt that this was being exaggerated and in some ways contributed to Putin's decision. And, subsequently over the weekend, Putin rattled the nuclear sabers by saying that he's putting his nuclear forces on high alert. And that's something that I'd like to get to in a moment. But I think he said that it was because of he didn't say mean, but the critical comments that have been leveled at him. And that's a pretty thin-skinned explanation for threatening mutual assured destruction, which we thought we had put back into Pandora's box at the end of the Cold War. So I'm no better than any other human being at identifying my own biases, but I try. And I also believe it's important to be honest with people, because there is such a lack of that in public commentary in the United States today. So I want to turn to the media, because we're seeing a very carefully constructed narrative that first and foremost is intended to restore the ratings of certain cable news outlets, and that we're also seeing them selectively present heroes in this current resistance by Ukrainians. And I don't want to diminish that the anecdotes that we're seeing about the man who briefly stood in front of a Russian tank, about the column of Russian tanks and other equipment that were destroyed on a bridge into Kiev, that a Russian tank ran out of fuel and the soldiers left it behind and then asked Ukrainians for food, which doesn't seem to understand the context that they're in. But we're being fed this, and one of the chat room commenters made the point that CNN is replaying some of the same footage and the same stories over and over again. And this leads many people to believe that they represent the bigger picture. And I have to say that while I'm rooting for Ukraine, I'm not optimistic that they can resist the massive Russian forces and the superior air power for a great length of time. And I'll note that the discredited David Petraeus, the architect of the surges and the counterinsurgency in both Afghanistan and Iraq, crawled out of his cubbyhole. But he said something that deserves to be heard, which is you should be careful about cornering Putin. That, the old poke the bear meme is something that we should take into account. And last week, I was talking with one of my brothers. He said, well, I just want to see some dead Russians. And I said, well, they've got nuclear weapons and they claim to have a hypersonic weapon. And he just kind of poo-pooed that. And that, I believe, is a big mistake. Because
reminds me of the second invasion of Iraq. People had a sense memory of Saddam Hussein from the first Gulf War. And after 9/11, they bought into the idea that he must have been behind 9/11. And there's a sense memory of Americans so stupid that they believe that Putin is a communist. And, Tommy Tuberville is calling him a socialist. It's easy to sell the American people on old enemies from 30.
And let me just ask people to watch critically, because there are two key things that underlie the narratives, the propaganda that we're being fed. One is the repeated use of the term regime to refer to the Russian government. That's just such a textbook, almost cartoonish, what do we call it? It's a trope of US foreign policy. And the other is that going back to Manuel Noriega in Panama and then Saddam in Iraq, and to a certain extent, Gaddafi in Libya, we create these Dr. Evil characters and feed them to the American public with a lot of salacious details. And this, if you couple it with Russiagate, and I'm a sharp critic of the way the media delivered that to the American people, we have groomed Americans to hate Putin so much that we are willing to risk a nuclear war, that we are overlooking the risks of blowback from the economic warfare that we have marshaled, and that we are completely oblivious to the level of offensive cyber warfare and international hacking that the United States engages in on a daily basis. And over the weekend, I had a drink with a guy who works in cybersecurity in Silicon Valley, kind of a know-it-all guy, but he does know a lot. And I said, I am concerned about that because we've seen vulnerabilities in the US cyber infrastructure that my former NSA whistleblowers told me were by design, so that the CIA and the NSA could hack into domestic internet sites. And so I just urge people to be extremely vigilant. Minimize your consumption of cable TV in particular. And I'd like to recommend 3 articles. 2 of them are easy to find on the homepage of Scheer Post, SCHEER. And that's Robert Scheer, the veteran lefty journalist. One is a column by Ralph Nader And I think it's very well written. He also cites Tom Friedman's column. Another is by Chris Hedges. Hedges is the former New York Times correspondent. And allow me to quote for a minute here.
Okay.
He says, preemptive war, whether in Iraq or Ukraine, is a war crime. It does not matter if the war is launched on the basis of lies and fabrications, as was the case in Iraq, or because of the breaking of a series of agreements with Russia, including the promise by Washington not to extend NATO beyond the borders of a unified Germany, not to deploy thousands of NATO troops in Eastern Europe, not to meddle in the internal affairs of nations on Russia's border, and the refusal to implement the Minsk II peace agreement. The invasion of Ukraine would, I expect, never have happened if these promises had been kept. Russia has every right to feel threatened, betrayed, and angry. But to understand is not to condone. The invasion of Ukraine under post-Nuremberg laws is a criminal war of aggression. And I agree with that statement. And finally, my old friend Robert Perry, who passed away about 5.5 years ago. Consortium News is a great outlet for critical commentary that doesn't toe the line of the US administration and the corporate media. And in a dispatch that Perry wrote following the Russian takeover of Crimea in 2014, this is dated March 2nd of 2015, a swaggering goofiness has come to dominate how the United States reacts to Russia, with American politicians and journalists dashing off tweets and op-eds, rushing to judgment about the perfidy of Moscow's leaders, blaming them for almost anything and everything. One more paragraph here. He said, these days, playing with nuclear fire is seen as a sign of seriousness and courage. Anyone who urges caution and suggests there might be two sides to the US-Russia story is dismissed as a wimp or a stooge. A what me worry groupthink has taken hold across the US ideological spectrum. Fretting about nuclear annihilation is so 1960s. And this is compounded by the crazy comments that Trump has made just in the past week that make it easy to take anyone who is critical of the US posture, anyone who offers a historical explanation for the motivation of Russia's military action. We're seen as idiots, as traitors, as Trumpers. And it's really important not to allow, as I referred to it, the fog of war to be used to force and foist a jingoistic American narrative that will likely be used to shift Biden's refusal to use US troops and to use US assets to confront this aggression. And so I hope people will remain clear-headed and take each of these stories as they come along in a very critical vein.
Has there ever been an American war that wasn't based on a lie?
Not that I know of.
War on poverty, maybe.
Yeah.
You have Mr. Swanson on. I know he's done your show. Great job. Thank you. Peter B. Collins, Bay Area Radio Hall of Famer. He should be listened to. Go to peterbcollins.com for a treasure trove of his podcasts, radio shows, and interviews. And we are blessed to have you on.
Thank you, David. I feel
Thank
blessed as well. Take care.